So, okay. Liz, can you give us your thoughts on Michael Collins and his involvement in the Irish War of Independence?
Well, to me, Collins was a hero figure. He's one of the first people I would have read about when I began looking at Irish history. He's certainly a person that dominated the whole War of Independence. Having been out in 1916, seeing the mistakes that were made in 1916, listening to the advice that John McBride had given when they were leaving Jacobs, never hold yourself up within four walls again, lads. And coupled with the next generation of revolutionaries, they did not only listen to that advice, they took it to the next level and brought the war to Great Britain, because 1916 in my mind was a battle in a war that was yet to come, and those that would be the driving force behind the next phase were the likes of Michael Collins. And I think with his organisational skills, not that Collins was out at every battle. We know that Collins was not on the streets fighting in the War of Independence, but he was directing everything. He was organising finances over intelligence. And what I find the amazing ability of that man was to organise, but to then get people to carry out your wishes. And you had to be a ruthless person to ask people to do what they had to do and then live with the results of their actions. But the War of Independence proved that those actions were necessary if they were going to get anything from the British government by way of some form of independence. So to me, Collins was a person, the right person at that time. He was maybe, he wasn't high on the list in 1916. He's only learned in 1916, but he learned very, very quickly, adapted it, as did his comrades, and then them all coming together culminates in the activities of the War of Independence, which then led to the truce, which led to then treaty negotiations. I don't think it could have happened without him.
Very good. Do you think was he 100% responsible for Bloody Sunday, and was that action necessary?
Bloody Sunday definitely was necessary, and Collins is the driving force behind making it happen. If you look at 1919, Collins and his intelligence unit, coupled with the squad, working together to target the DMP men that were operating in Dublin, people who knew the activities of the IRA volunteers, who were the key people. They were the eyes and ears of Dublin Castle, and they neutralised them very quickly. The British administration were taken completely off guard, but it was only for a short time. The British government began to reorganise their own intelligence, realised they had informers in their midst, but didn't necessarily know who they were, so they set up their own intelligence units. They began to have successes against Collins and against his men, against volunteers around the country. And by the time we come to mid-1920, it was at that stage us and them. Something had to be done. And especially by November, because Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, he had looked at the successes that the Crown Forces had in Ireland, arrests that were being made, people that had been killed. Sean Tracy had been killed in Talbot Street. He kicked off the War of Independence really in Sola Headbeck in 1919. You had Terence McSweeney, who had died in prison as a result of the hunger strikes. So the big losses were suffered by the IRA. Lloyd George makes a speech at the Lord Mayor's banquet in London: "We have murder by the throat." Now that was an outright threat to Collins and the IRA that were coming for us, we're going to get you. Someone had to strike first, and Collins decided it was going to be him. But he did not completely plan this or oversee it himself. He had to get permission from Cattle Brewer, who had the final say on who was listed that day. The British were caught completely off guard because it did it sent shockwaves to their core because they thought they were gaining the upper hand. And that's what you find, that's what I have found the way the War of Independence goes. It goes in waves. There's successes by the IRA, successes by the Crown Forces. It's tit for tat, but it increases and gets worse at every level. And by God, did Collins orchestrate a deadly blow to them with the events that happened on Bloody Sunday.
Very good. And how do you think Michael Collins is perceived today, firstly by the Irish people and then by historians?
Well, Michael Collins is a divisive figure. People love him, people hate him. The film has, done a lot to bring the story of Collins out, but it's a very glamorized Hollywood version of the man. I think now people are beginning to realise that Collins isn't this two-dimensional figure. Collins is a person like all of us. He didn't know everything. He made mistakes. He was human at the end of the day. And I think that's where historians as well are starting to go, that they are looking at the man behind the name. Because at the end of the day, Collins died young. So Collins can be, the person who would have won women's rights, if he had lived. He would have taken on the church. Collins would have done this. Collins would have done that. We actually don't know because Collins died. So we can be the person we want him to be. Whereas like De Valera lived, so we know what they did, and don't agree with what they did, or there will always be debates about that. But Collins can be something that we can imagine. He would have done this. He wouldn't have done that. Truth is, we don't know. So in that respect, he can be something for every person. But with the records that are now being released, with the statements, the stories that are coming out, we're beginning to see the complex person that he was. To have the weight of what he had on his shoulders at such a young age, that is huge. And to be able to compartmentalise all of those different aspects of the work, as well as to try and have a personal life and carry on and not let it get into you. It took some taking, he was some man to be able to do that. But I think that's where historians are going now, and not just for Collins. They're looking at the people behind these names, because at the end of the day, history is made by ordinary people in extraordinary situations, and sometimes they get it right, they don't have all the answers, but the one thing that we tend to forget is they're human, and I think that's where we're looking at now, looking at the people behind those names.